I don't give this talk that often anymore, but I do occasionally go to places and give the talk. I'm working on a range of other projects at the moment. But some of you may have seen this talk before. And those of you who have, I used to, until yesterday, I would always make the joke that it's worth seeing again because history is always changing. And that's until yesterday, because I was on a flight from Tel Aviv and I met a professor and we started chatting on the plane. He's an academic, very, very respected academic, and a professor in Israel. And he explained to me that he has been working on a paper which will prove, who has heard of the Khazars? Who has heard of the, that's cool, that's good, that's good, that's good, that's good that none of you have heard. I love it when audiences don't know what I'm talking about because I can just talk freely and say what I want. The Khazars were like a nomadic, warlike people living in the Caucasus in the 8th century and en masse converted to Judaism. One could understand that historically because they were living at the border of the Christian and Islamic worlds. And they were very, very famous. We know this from a famous letter that was written to Spain in the 10th century. And there's a whole history that emerges, the book written by Yehuda Halevi called the Kuzari, which is one of the great medieval texts of comparative religion. And we know all this. He's sitting on a plane from Tel Aviv with me yesterday. The Khazars didn't exist. Didn't happen. Massive subject in Jewish. No. I said, what about the letter to Spain? Forgery. What about that? No, didn't exist. I don't know if he's right. He could be wrong. But it is definitely an illustration of the fact that history is always changing. What I'm going to try and do in this talk is give over a narrative that I think, for the best, certainly from my perception, taking a range of different stories, we can more or less rely upon. There are two dimensions to Jewish history. One is what we might call the theo-historical. That it is where the Jewish people emerge from what is perceived to be perhaps a mythic theo-historical background, and there is the Jewish people in objective reality when we talk about historical facts. And I will show where one goes into the other. What's important to stay at the beginning, and I know that I'm speaking to an audience that is probably got a few Jewish people in it and may have a large number of people who are not so acquainted with the profundity and meaning of Jewish history, is that Jewish history for Jews, the study of Jewish history, is actually a commandment in the Bible. If you look at the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, verse 7, Zechor yemot olam binu shenot dor vador. Remember the days of the world, understand the years of every generation. So we have a commandment to study Jewish history, and for Jewish people, Jewish history provides a great sense of meaning and continuum to what their project actually is in the world. If you don't know history, you don't know where you're coming from, and that's true for any people. The problem is that the Jewish people have such an enormous, a ginormous, that's not a word in English, a ginormous history, that it's difficult sometimes to get our head around it. And so we have a talk like this. Now, what I'm going to do, just for the next minute, I know that I've been talking for 5 minutes and have not yet said anything of substance. And you can go to sleep for most of this talk. But it's probably useful to know how the talk works in case you wake up and you want to know what I'm doing. Some of you may have noticed that there is paper on all the walls. Yep. Okay, here's how it works. Jewish history is 4,000 years. That's the picture we're going to look at. Each wall is 1,000 years. I'm going to start over here. I'm not so sadistic that I'm going to make everyone turn around at this point. Wow. Wow. Well, that's useful. So, the way it works is this. Each wall is 1,000 years. That's approximately a millennium. I'm going to start I'm going to use the secular counting. The Jewish people have their own Hebrew counting. The current year in the Hebrew counting is 5,772. But I'm going to use the common counting of the world, and I'm going to start here at minus 2000. That's 2000 BCE. And I'm going to, if that's minus 2000, what is this going to be? Minus 1000. Very, very good. So that's going to be minus 1000. Over there is going to be what? Zero. There was no year zero. People didn't wake up on January the 1st and go, yeah, it's the year zero. No. But theoretically, there's the year zero. That corner is going to be 1000 CE, and we're going to end up approximately where I started in this corner. That means that for some of this talk, we will be turning around and facing. You don't want to pay chiropractic bills for the rest of your life. It's best to just turn your chair and face the wall I'm talking about. Well, thank you very, very much. Okay, we can get started.
Yeah.
Now you understand why I've never finished this talk in under an hour. So that's one wake-up moment, and now you can go to sleep. Jewish history begins with the first Jewish person. And before I talk about the first Jewish person, I'm going to do something, and I need absolute silence. Do not try this at home, especially if you don't have paper on the walls. Took me years of practice. You will need to be a little careful over there. I'm going to be running past you. No, I really am. I'm going to draw the first millennium of Jewish history. Are you ready? There, done. Now, good. We're now going to put in some, so call that minus 1500. Okay. The first Jewish person is, of course, Abraham. Abraham is the first person to realize that it is possible to have a relationship, a direct relationship, both collectively and individually, with the creator of the universe. That is the essential point of monotheistic tradition. That is the essential point of Judaism. By the way, just one more moment of staying awake and then go to sleep. Just one more moment. If this is the whole 4,000 years of Jewish history, and it starts here, just so you understand, everything up to here is the Bible. All right? So we can get a scale of it. Now, even within the Bible, we have different periods of theo-historical and objective history. We don't have any evidence for much of this particular period of Jewish history. There's no rock that says, hi, I'm Abraham, I was here. But we have emerged as a continuum in the world from obviously a proto-monotheistic culture that emerges in the Middle East. Abraham has this very special relationship that is described in the Bible. Abraham marries a woman called Sarah. They have a son called Isaac. This is all the Bible. I know you know the Bible. I'm going to do it very quickly. Isaac has a son called Jacob. Of course, this is the period of the Avot, the great patriarchs of the Jewish people, all in the book of Genesis. It's not just Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's also, of course, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Of course, very, very topical, because in chapter 17 of the book of Genesis, God lays out to Abraham the whole of Jewish history, basically, and says to him, your descendants will be around at the end of history. And they will not survive randomly, they will survive for a purpose. That purpose is to reveal the oneness of the divine in the world and to bring peace to the world. And that relationship between Abraham and God, and Isaac and God, and Jacob and God, is known in Jewish history and in Jewish thought. We call that the concept of Brit, the concept of covenant. Brilliant. Thank you. Abraham goes, well, that's all very well, God, but could you please go back to the part where I have to circumcise myself? That is part of the covenantal relationship that the Avot have with God. Now, Jacob's other name is Israel. And Jacob has 12 sons and a daughter. And the most famous of those sons is Joseph. And Joseph takes the whole family down to Egypt for the first of a recurring phenomenon in Jewish history that I'm going to do in red, called Galut. Galut means exile. How do you say exile in German? Exil. What is exil in Hebrew? Galut. I do it in red. All right. For the first and only time, we were a slave class, a subpopulation within a wider situation in Egypt. But eventually, 1400, 1300, 1100. I'm going to have to start going fast. Eventually, we are redeemed from Egypt, from slavery, by God. There's a splitting of the Red Sea under the administrative leadership of Moses. And we are brought, by this time, the 12 sons of Israel have become the 12 tribes of the children of Israel, and we are brought before Mount Sinai, where the covenant that was made with the Avot, is now reaffirmed with an entire nation. We are now no longer just the children of Israel, we are now Am Yisrael. At Mount Sinai, God lays out before us an entire ethical, moral, spiritual, social justice program that is to take us through the whole of history, that is called the Torah. Now, very important to know. At Sinai, God said many things. Many things. But they can all be boiled down to two words in English. I don't know how it's going to work in German. It probably is going to work in German as well, but there's basically two words. Be nice. Be nice. Don't oppress one another. Don't exploit the disadvantaged in your society. Don't let the gap between rich and poor become too great. If you're going to, make sure people have equal facility before law. If you're going to build a society, it must be a society founded on social justice. I can tolerate many things, says God. I mean, I have a little problem with idol worship, but I can tolerate many things, says God, but I will not tolerate social injustice. Now, if you're going to build this ideal society, you need somewhere to do it. And in fact, we have a place to do it because we have a land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that is the land of Israel. So for the last quarter of this millennium, 250, 300-year period, this period in Jewish history is known as Kibush Haaretz, the conquering of the land. We were technologically disadvantaged. We came into the land. Our main enemy at the time in the land was a people called the Philistines, whose spiritual and cultural center was in Gaza. If you're looking for a period in history that most resembles our own, it is that. Amazingly, although with some subtle differences. Obviously, it's impossible to understand Jewish history without seeing it embedded in world history. What is going on at this time in world history? Like a big event, we all learned it at school, but I'm just bringing it down for us. It is the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age, and that is happening right where we are. The Hittites have worked out how to crank up an oven to 800 degrees Celsius. They can smelt iron. We do not have that technology. It took a few centuries for us to eventually, in this period, settle the land. And so we settled, that's the land of Israel, by the way. We settle it according to the tribal allotments. Each tribe has its own chunk of land. Everybody follow so far? But there is no central administration. The Tanakh tells us, Ein melech b'Yisrael. There's no king in Israel. Ish hayashar be'enav ya'aseh. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. It was like a spiritual anarchy. There was no central administration. Eventually, we get to here, and we go to the spiritual leader of the age, the prophet Samuel, and we say to him, we would like a king. And Samuel says, you don't want a king. You, the Jewish people, the people of Israel, you are unique. Your relationship is directly with God, your Father in heaven. You don't want a king. And we go, yes, we understand, but kings are cool. We want one. Samuel goes, listen, a king is going to rule over you. He's going to take your sons and put them in his army. He's going to take your daughters and marry them off to his mates. He's going to start wars you don't want. He's going to build buildings you don't want. He's going to tax you. Yeah, we understand all that, but kings are cool. Can we have one? Samuel goes to God. He goes, they want a king. God says, if they want a king, I will give them the king that they deserve. So we get this big, tall, hunky guy called Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. He doesn't quite work out. And then we get the big king. The big king. And the big king is David. And David goes bang, bang, and he smashes all the enemies of Israel. And he turns this little country into a regional superpower, in the context of which he also captures the Jebusite city of stronghold, fortress of Jerusalem, and turns it into the eternal capital of the Jewish people. That happens in 1000 BCE, 3,000 years ago. David is the big king. But big kings die, David dies, and he is succeeded by his son Solomon. That's how I get my name there. But he, and in his son Shlomo, King Solomon, oh, I see. Now I understand the translation. You're getting the jokes like 5 seconds later. I get it. All right. And in Jerusalem, King Solomon, the son of King David, builds a temple. This temple was to be an everlasting, eternal building dedicated to God in Jerusalem. In fact, now everything's gone according to plan. We have the Brit, the covenant with the Avot. We have the Galut. We come out of Galut. We get the Torah. We have the big revelation. We conquer the land. We get the big king. And then the big king's son builds the temple. It's done. That's the plan. We have entered effectively a proto-messianic period. But as always, there are problems. Now, what's going to happen now? What's going to happen now is this. Don't talk, because if you talk, it takes a lot longer. I would like everyone to swivel their chair 90 degrees so everyone's facing this way. Trust me, if you don't do this, it's going to be much... Yeah, exactly. Very good. Now, while that's happening, I will draw the Second Millennium. Now, all right, so I'm going to call this minus 500. Remember, we are still minus 600, minus 700, minus 800, minus 900. We are still in the Bible. This is one of those wake-up moments. It's very difficult to understand Jewish history without understanding what happens after King Solomon dies. After he dies, for a range of reasons, this united kingdom of 12 tribes becomes split into two kingdoms. One, a northern kingdom containing 10 tribes called the Kingdom of Israel, and a southern kingdom containing just 2 tribes and the city of Jerusalem called the Kingdom of Yehudah or Judah. For the next 200 years, this is all in the Bible, these 2 kingdoms are in parallel, sometimes at war, sometimes ignoring each other, sometimes at cooperating, but there are 2 kingdoms. What is very important to understand about this period is we start to see the degradation of social justice, particularly in the northern kingdom. The gap between rich and poor becomes wider. The disadvantaged are exploited. There is a rise in the search for power through idol worship. everything becomes decayed at a fundamental level in these societies, despite the rise of a new institution in the Jewish people called the rise of the Navi, the prophet, who is screaming the words of God to anybody who would listen, but especially to kings, about this fall in social justice. Eventually, the situation got so bad that here, in around minus 720, there's a new power in the region, the expanding Neo-Assyrian Empire, and there's the northern kingdom, and they come and they ethnically cleanse the whole of the northern kingdom, the whole of the 10 tribes, and send them into the dustbin of history, we think. We have not really seen them since. The kingdom of Judah struggles on, but even that suffers a tremendous degradation. And here, in minus 586, this everlasting building built by King Solomon and dedicated to God is destroyed, setting the Jewish people on a traumatic cataclysm from which in some ways they've never really recovered. It is from this point onwards that the people of Israel are known as the Jewish people, the remnant of Israel, from Judah, Judaism and Jewish, because we don't know what happened to the 10 tribes, and the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed in minus 586 BCE. But, of course, we go into another galut. What is the meaning of the word galut? Very good. This particular hello. Yeah, I didn't see that. This particular galut, this person understands what I'm This particular galut was the Babylonian exile, but as famously prophesied by the prophet Jeremiah just before the destruction of the temple, this exile would last only 70 years. And indeed, after exactly 70 years, we came back because the big bad Assyrians were eventually, the big bad Babylonians, who were the ones who destroyed the temple, were eventually destroyed themselves and overtaken by the new power, who were the Persians. And the big new Persian ruler Cyrus decreed that not only can the Jews go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, he's going to pay for it. He's going to sponsor the project. So we come back here and we rebuild the temple. Now, this is a very, very important thing I'm going to say. What I'm going to say now, if you remember nothing from this talk except what I'm going to say now, it's this. From King David onwards, it's possible to understand Jewish history. I didn't make this up. This is Jewish history itself. In discrete 500-year blocks. Every 500 years, the Jewish people go through a major phasic transition to another period. It's interesting because we're in one of those transitions right now. But from King David, and possibly even before, but we'll go from King David. So if we understand the major spiritual project of each epoch, each 500-year epoch, then the details simply fit in and it's possible to get one's head around Jewish history. That's the whole point of what I want to show you. This period here, this 500-year period from King David until here is known originally and creatively as that's disgusting. The entire thing has emerged. Right. I may need some paper towels if anyone is so. I'll totally destroy that. No, it's very. Yeah, at least. Thank you so much. Oh, brilliant. Oh, now, this period here is known as the First Temple period. Known officially in Jewish history. This is what we call bayit. What's the meaning of the word bayit? House. What's the meaning of the word rishon? First. This is bayit rishon, the first house, the first temple. So when we came back, we start the next 500-year phase in Jewish history, which is known creatively and originally as the Second Temple period, which we call bayit sheni, the second house, the second temple. Now, 400, 300, 200, 100. I'm here to tell you that scholars have been crawling all over the Second Temple period for a long time. It's a very, very complex period, the Second Temple period. We have to start looking at it in world history terms. I'm going to give it to you in about 3 minutes. It is, in fact, complex, but we can understand it. We can understand it in 4 discrete phases. Don't panic. Don't panic. It's a lot simpler than that. The first period of the Second Temple, you see, we are basically at this point, who's in charge? Who's in charge? Who's in charge of the land of Israel? The Persians, exactly. We are like a colonial outpost of the Persian Empire. So long as we pay our taxes and we don't revolt and we're good boys and girls, they leave us more or less alone. We're busy trying to reconstruct an economy, reconstruct a society, but this is the Persian period until here. Because here, everything changes. Everything changes. Why? Because one morning, oh dude, thank you. Because one morning, probably a Tuesday, thank you, a young man wakes up and decides that it would be a good idea, he thinks, to conquer the world. His father had already tried to conquer the world, but wasn't quite so successful. But young Alexander said that whereas his father, Philip of Macedon, had failed, he was going to succeed. And in fact, in a stunning series over about 10 years of conquests and military invasions, the dude conquers just about the whole of the known world, from Greece all the way to India, including us. Now you say, well, what's that got to do with anything? Because the whole of the rest of world history, let alone Jewish history, is probably just a footnote to that event. But it wasn't just a military conquest. Who was Alexander's teacher? I mean, not he went to this school and he saw this guy's photo on the wall. His actual teacher, appointed to him by his father, was Aristotle. Aristotle's teacher was Plato. Plato's teacher was Socrates. In other words, our encounter with Alexander was an encounter with the very heart of this new ideology in the world called Hellenism. Now, I don't need to explain to a learned audience in Berlin anything about Hellenism, but I will spend 15 seconds on it if people indicate that that would be a good thing, because it's very important to understand. Shall I spend 15 seconds of it? Okay. Probably the best way to explain it is like this. When a Hellenistic man wakes up in the morning, what's the first thing he does? Hellenistic man wakes up in the morning and goes, "Oh, that's fantastic. Look at that body. Look at those rippling abs. There's nothing I can't do with this body. I can run, I can swim, I can jump, Whoa! Whoa! Who's thinking those thoughts? What is this amazing, precise, rational instrument I have in my head called my mind? Whoa, the mind, the body, poor. What a thing to be a man, especially in the nude. Now, what does a Jew do when... What does a Jew do when he wakes up in the morning? The last thing he's going to look at is his body. And he thanks God for returning his soul, and he goes about his existence. Hellenic culture is based on many, many external attributes: truth, beauty, harmony, all of which are complex concepts, but it's very visually oriented. Jews have always gone according to what they can hear. Shema Yisrael, we are told. And what are we told to listen to? That inner voice inside us that tells us the difference between right and wrong, between good and evil. Concepts that Greek thought never really got around to discussing. In other words, as someone famously said, they gave us art, we gave them guilt. But this encounter has massive implications for the whole of world history. All right, so, however, I'm going to lose track of time. For this, I enjoy talking about the Hellenic so much. This period here, we are a basketball between... When Alexander died... See, that's the problem with young men who try to conquer the world. They die. And when he died, I'm going to show you something. This is, by the way, this is minus 300. I'm going to show you a very complex device. What's that? That is the Mediterranean. If you don't believe me, go there. For those of you who are confused, that's the water. Now, here's the land of Israel. When Alexander died, his conquests were divided up amongst his generals, but for our purposes, we have two big Hellenic-based dynasties here, the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid. And we are caught in this war. It was very trendy in the ancient world to be Hellenic. These places are trying to out-Hellene each other. And eventually, by the time we get to here, we are definitely in the grip of the Seleucid Empire, and rulers like Antiochus IV get up and say, look, I don't have a problem with Jews. Some of my best friends are Jews. I have a problem with Jewish spirituality. I have a problem with Torah. The Jews are not Hellenic enough. So in a series of decrees, he bans circumcision, and he bans the Sabbath, and he bans a range of other things, but it's particularly those two. And eventually, the high priesthood in Jerusalem itself becomes corrupt, and we get to the point where things are so bad that round about here, we are sacrificing pigs to Zeus Olympus on the Temple Mount itself. That became intolerable, and so we had a ginormous revolt. That revolt is, of course, the story of Hanukkah. That is the rejection of Hellenic dominion and the re-establishment of an autonomous, sovereign Jewish state in the land of Israel and in the temple by the Hasmoneans. By the way, those of you who are following, if that's Hanukkah, Purim, by the way, happens back here round about the time, if it's a historical event, round about the time of the return of the Second Temple, so I'll do a little hum and tush in there. Now, Hanukkah, a festival that most of you would have heard of at least, is really just the warm, fluffy PR exercise of the Hasmoneans. Overall, they were a disaster. And by the time we get to here, the situation is so bad. After 100 years of independent Hasmonean rule, they made several crucial errors, what we now know in historical hindsight to be what we think are pretty serious geopolitical errors. But by the time we get to here, the situation is so bad that the last two remains of the Hasmonean Empire, these two brothers are actually launching a civil war over the Temple Mount itself. The situation is so bad that we invite the new power in the region, who is, of course, Rome. The Romans to come in, and that's really the beginning of the end as far as the Second Temple is concerned. So we have four phases of the Second Temple: the Persian, the Greek, the Hasmonean, which was a completely... That's why the state of Israel bases a lot of its symbology on the Hasmonean dynasty, because it was a completely independent Jewish state in the land of Israel. And then, but by this time, we are in Rome. Now, one of the mistakes that the Hasmoneans had made was the forcible conversion of a neighboring nation called the Idumeans under John Hyrcanus, round about here. That was to have very bad karma, because by the time we get to here, a descendant of that forced conversion rose up in the ranks to effectively, it's a very complex story, but eventually got Rome to appoint him as king over Israel. And that, of course, is Herod. Now, Herod was one of the biggest despotic, maniacal, psychotic bastards ever to rule over the Jewish people, but he was an amazing builder. That's why when you go to Israel today, your tour guide will tell you, oh, Herod built that, oh, and that's Herod, oh, and Herod built that. You know, he built Masada, and he built Caesarea, and he built two places called Herodium. And his big project, his uber project, was in fact to rebuild the whole of the Second Temple itself, which he transformed into the largest and most magnificent religious edifice in the ancient world. There's one more thing I need to tell you about before we leave the Second Temple. During the lead up to the end of the Second Temple, for the last couple of centuries already, there was a growing conflict in the Jewish world about what Judaism actually is. And there are two conflicting visions. One is, Judaism is about the temple. It's about the priests. It's about the sacrifices. It's all a priestly cult. They became a faction known as the Sadducees. There was another faction that had been collating for a long time, the oral and dynamic interpretations of the written Torah in applied situations. They were the scholars and the sages who went on to take on the brand name of the rabbis. The real turning point for the rabbis was the establishment of large schools of thought, and the most famous of the early schools of thought is, of course, the House of Hillel. And so those of you who are familiar with the thought of Hillel, to place in historical context, Hillel is a contemporary of Herod. However, by the time we get to the year 0, Herod is dead, and his sons are fighting for control of the place, and Rome says, we're not going to have any more Jewish kings, we're going to rule directly from Rome through a series of governors. That is the situation that is happening as you turn your chairs and face this wall. It's only now going to start getting interesting, and I have to move fast. I have to move fast. 100, 200, 300, 400. Now, where do we go? Right, so we have a series of governors. This is, look, if we met for 2 hours every day for the next 6 months, we would not be able to cover everything that is contained in just this 100 years. This 100 years itself is its own subset of Jewish history known as first century Palestine. In fact, everything I'm talking about tonight is only headlines of headlines. Each detail is a doorway that you can go into. We're just looking at a framework now by which we can understand the narrative. But basically what's happening here, very complex, a series of governors. Each governor was a bigger psycho than the one before. And eventually, it gets to the point where the random decrees are so great that in the year 66, we can't take it anymore and we revolt. By the way, by this time, there is the land of Israel is still the center of the Jewish world, but there is a growing and dynamic diaspora that is happening. We have large communities in Babylonia, we have even a community in Rome, and we have a very big community in Alexandria in Egypt, which is like the New York of its day. But the center is still the Jewish world, still the land of Israel. And in 66, we just can't take it, and we revolt against Roman rule. The emperor at the time is Nero. And Nero sent, in 1 second, thank you. And Nero sends his top soldier, Vespasian, with a ginormous army, and they march through the land, destroying all resistance. Eventually, they get, in around 68, they get to Jerusalem and they surround Jerusalem and they siege it. Obviously, inside the city is panic and pandemonium. However, the spiritual leader of the age, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, a student of Hillel, gets himself smuggled out of the city and has a conversation with Vespasian. I know, says Yochanan ben Zakkai to Vespasian, that if you don't destroy this temple, somebody else will, because the divine presence left the building some time ago. However, Judaism does not belong in a building. We are a people. We have a God. We have a land. We have a Torah. There is only one thing that is going to ensure the survival of the Jewish people for all generations. Apart from the protection of God and the memory of this place, there's only one thing, and that one thing, and that one thing alone is Jewish education. Give me the town of Yavne, he said, where I can, it's a small coastal town near the coast of Israel, and I can rebuild the spiritual and educational and social infrastructure of the Jewish people. Vespasian's very impressed. He gives him the town of Yavne, and the Vespasian himself goes back to become emperor, and his son Titus, in the year 70, there's no smoke because the sacrifices have finished, comes and destroys the temple. Now, if the Romans rule over you in the ancient world, they have a very unique way of doing things. If the Romans rule over you and you revolt, they come and they kill you. However, killing you is only the warning. If you revolt again, they come and they completely crush you and wipe you from history. We revolted against the Romans 3 times. And we are still here. And the Romans apparently are not. That is the testament to the power of Yochanan ben Zakkai's vision and of this project of Yavna. The second revolt happened in 115 to 117 under the Emperor Trajan, but the big daddy revolt is here. 132 to 135. This is the Big Papa Revolt. Hadrian is the emperor. And Hadrian says something like, look, I don't have a problem with Jews. Some of my best friends are Jews. I have a problem with Jewish spirituality. And in a series of decrees, which started with no circumcision, no public observance of Sabbath, Shabbat, but it was the third decree, no public teaching of Torah, that caused the great spiritual leader of the age, Rabbi Akiva, to back the revolt of Bar Kokhba. And you know, first Bar Kokhba has some limited but significant success. They create a little state there with Jerusalem as its capital. Hadrian goes ballistic, literally, sends a gasquillion, that's not a number, I just made it up, but big number, of soldiers from all over the empire, and in 135 at Beitar, they completely crush Bar Kokhba's resistance army. Something, conservative estimates say something like 500,000 Jewish soldiers died. He razes Jerusalem to the ground, and he changes the name of the place from Iudea to, after our traditional enemies from the Bible, the Philistines, he changes the name to Palestina. That is Hadrian. He ends all Jewish sovereign autonomy in the land of Israel until here. Think how amazing it is that we live in a generation where there is Jewish autonomy in the land of Israel. However, all of these tragic and terrible events actually have nothing to do with what this 500-year period is actually all about. Now I have to move really quickly. This 500-year period here is known in Jewish history, not by me officially, but is known as the Talmudic. You see, Yavna produced some impressive projects and products, and by the time we get to here, around minus 200, all of the many, many thousands of recorded dynamic interpretations of the Torah are now codified and written down in a tremendous, one of the Jewish people's most tremendous contribution to world spiritual and legal culture, a document called the Mishnah. And remember, we produce the Mishnah when most people in the world are still eating and worshipping cockroaches. The Mishnah, for the next 300 years, the Mishnah is discussed and I know that's a bit rough. Discussed and dissected and explored, and its underlying principles discovered and whatever. And that discussion of the Mishnah is known as the Gemara. And the equation is Mishnah plus Gemara equals Talmud. And of course, being the Jewish people, we have 2 Talmuds. We have one Talmud, same Mishnah, but because the conversation happened in the land of Israel, that's the Jerusalem Talmud, but it also happened in the dynamic new center of Babylonia, and that became the big Babylonian Talmud, which was sealed around here. The Jerusalem Talmud was sealed here. This period is famous for its spiritual project and its product. It's the Talmudic period, which is using the principle of the what we call kvod ha'adam, the dignity of the human being, as its guiding light is the Mishnah. It dynamically interprets the written Torah for everyday situations. But it's impossible to understand Jewish history without seeing it embedded in world history, and I just have to spend 1 minute on this, because many of you are sitting there going, oh, I can't believe he's not talking about this, and I'm going to talk about this. Back here, a Jewish boy wakes up one morning, probably a Friday, and he said, well, you know, maybe he is a bit special, but boom, his friends, and he goes, and as so often happens to young Jewish boys who think they might be the Messiah, who have encounters with the Romans, he dies. Now, it's important to understand that the early Christian church is really a persecuted sect of Judaism. There was a persecuted religion, and we were doing a lot of the persecuting. The big turning point for Christianity, as many of you know, comes here, because the Emperor Constantine fights a battle in the name of Christianity and he wins, so now Christianity is a tolerated religion. And about 20 years later, when Constantine is carking it, he converts. And what happens when the emperor converts to a religion? It becomes the religion of the empire. In other words, from here onwards, Rome is officially Christian. And that is not good news for the Jews. Second thing we need to understand is this. We have, in fact, 3 domains of influence, and I'm going to put them here. There's the Mediterranean. As I say, if you don't believe me, go there. This is Spain, that's Italy, that's Greece, that's Turkey, that's Egypt, this is North Africa, there's the land of Israel, there's Babylonia. Everybody follow? Now, there's still some people who don't get. There's the water. Right, now. Here, the Roman Empire was affected. Most historians say round about here the Roman Empire is pretty much, certainly the Western Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire had become split between East and West. The Western Roman Empire got sacked by the Vandals, the Visigoths, and so on, and we plunged into the Dark Ages. The Eastern Roman Empire, the split was here, the Eastern Roman Empire went on to take on the fancy brand name of Byzantium. But we have a third sphere of influence, with the biggest Jewish community in the world now in Babylonia, and this is the newly reconstituted Sassanid Persian Empire. So these 3 domains are really fighting it out, but this one is really now. There are dotted Jewish communities slowly taking place in other places, but this is the center of the Jewish world at the moment. But none of these can see the big historical tsunami that is about to come and wipe everything away. Because 600, 700, 800, 900, 1000, because here in 570 is born Muhammad. And as you know, in 610, around the age of 40, he's wandering around those caves outside Mecca, you know the ones, and he has this revelation with the Archangel Gabriel, who dictates to him the Quran. And so it is that within an unbelievably explosive space of time, Islamic. Persian Empire, gone. Byzantine Empire. Now, obviously, that has ramifications for the world. The big turning point for Islam comes in the year 711. What happens in 711? In 711, Islam conquers Spain. And I don't need to remind you that Spain is a European country. That sent shockwaves through the world then, as it probably would now. However, it was conquered by like these chilled Islamic guys called the Moors. And the Moors said, we like Jews, and we want to invite Jews in to help us build a new, magnificent civilization. And whichever Jews can get here can basically do what they want. They can pursue what they want. They just have to get here. It's not yet the golden age of Spain, but it's laying the groundwork for it. However, the center of the Jewish world is still Babylonia. This period in Jewish history, this 500-year period, is known in Jewish history as the Gaonic. Who were the Gaonim? In Babylonia, we had 2 massive academies, Sura and Pumbedita. The heads of those academies were not just the spiritual leaders of Babylonian Jewry, they were the spiritual leaders of the whole of the Jewish world. If you were sitting in Cologne in the 5th century, and you put a meat spoon in a milk cup and you didn't know what to do, you would have to write 3 months to Babylonia and get an answer. They were, in fact, guiding the whole of the Jewish world from Babylonia. However, the really important thing to realize, and of course, this is beautiful. This is where is meant to be the Khazars. They're gone. Now, however, and you can see why the Khazars would become the Khazars. They're sitting here. Anyway, here's a wake-up moment. Over the course of the last couple of centuries of this period, there is a slow, inexorable leak from Babylonia in other directions, west. Not a result of any one cataclysmic event, but Jews are on the move. Some Jews are building communities here, going mostly through Christian countries, and they're having very different experiences from Jews going through these countries. The primary thing about the Gaonic period is that it establishes the foundations of what we now call the Jewish community. If the Talmudic period was discussing what Judaism should look like, the Gaonic period was trying to discuss what Judaism does look like. What does it mean to be a diaspora? What are the essential facilities and institutions that we need in Jewish communities? Communal kashrut. I don't know how you would translate kashrut. The calendar, all of the different, the Siddur, the prayer books, all of these different manifestations we now take for granted. Formal Judaism really takes its form in the Gaonic period. But there is, by the time you get to the year 1000, the last of the great Gaonim, Rav Hai Gaon, very cool name, Hai. Rav Hai Gaon gets up and looks around and he says, I'm basically Gaon over no one. There's no one left here. Where have they all gone? Now, as I said, the Jews traveling here had different experiences from the Jews traveling here. The first Jews to get to places like Germany and Western Europe saw a local people who saw their own roots as being in the spiritual roots, as being in Scandinavia, which they called Skansia. And the Jews went, Skansia. That sounds very much like one of the great exilic destinations mentioned in the Bible. The Bible predicts the Jews will go on this massive exile, and there'll be two great destinations. That sounds a lot like the lands of Ashkenaz. This must be Ashkenaz. And the Jews who went this way, through North Africa and onto Spain, said, well, if that's Ashkenaz, this must be the other great exilic destination mentioned in the book of Obed. This must be the lands of Sfarad. So the distinction, not so much ethnic, but more cultural and geographic, between Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jewry also takes its rise from the late Gaonic period, when Jews were massively on the move, creating communities. We see evidence of that today, by the way. Germany is a fantastic place to see evidence of that. If you go to somewhere like Köln, you will actually see there's like a 6th century mikveh in the center of the town, deep in excavation. All right. However, now I have to do this massively quickly, and I have to summarize this, and I don't know how we're going to go, but I'm going to try. The later we get in history, the more we know. Therefore, it gets very, very complex. And not only that, the real key to this 500-year block, which is known in Jewish history as the period of the Rishonim. That's from our perspective. The Rishonim mean the first ones. And I will hopefully try and explain that in the next 2 minutes. There is no center of the Jewish world now. It's not just that we have, first of all, we have an amazing community and situation taking on in Spain. By the time we get to, you've got to pretend this doesn't exist, okay? This doesn't exist. Right, I go from here to here. Don't get confused. Don't think there's like 200 years that we don't know about. It's like here. Now, this is the golden age of Spain. Jews are not only becoming Jews in their own right, they're becoming contributors to civic society. People like Shmuel Hanagid, who was the general of the army of Granada. People like Chasta ibn Shaprut, who was effectively the treasurer of Spain. And I don't think we've ever had it so good until maybe 20th century America, as in the golden age of Spain. So that was one thing that was going on. But in Europe, and the rest of Europe, as in much of the world, things were very, very bad for the Jews. The whole of the medieval period is a period of massacre and awful exiles and expulsions and forced conversions and blood libels and book burnings and more massacres and random taxations and more massacres. It is a miracle that the Jews survived in Europe this entire period, although in Spain the situation was a lot better, obviously, and not to mention the fact that here, all right, guys, I wasn't going to say this. I wasn't going to say it. They said, don't go to Germany and say this. Don't say this there, but I'll say it. Should I say it? Should I say it? Will you forgive me? Can I apologize in advance? Okay, what? All right, who's this? Who's this? That is Urban II. Job description, Pope. And he is announcing the First Crusade. As you know, the Crusades are an awfully miserable project that landed everyone exactly where they started at the cost of millions of lives and awful misery. It was an attempt by Western Christianity to get the Holy Land back from the Muslims. Now, this is in 1095. As we know, this is just an example of the sort of thing that was going on in the Middle Ages. The first crusading army under Godfrey of Bouillon, they said, oh, we don't need to go all the way to the Holy Land to kill non-Christians. We've got them right here. And they massacre all of the Jewish communities in the Rhineland. All of them. So people go, you know, this is the controversial bit. Huh? You ready? People go, you know, I have students who come and they go, oh, they don't realize that the Shoah is not an isolated event. The project to exterminate the Jews of Germany happens here and here and here and here and here and here. And so people say, so why did Jews keep going back to Germany? I mean, it's a stunning country. We all know that. But why did Jews keep going back? And I say, look at your own generation. Only half a century after the Holocaust. And what is the largest growing Jewish community in the world outside of Israel? It's Germany. And yet, and here's the really controversial bit, and I apologize in advance, surely, the lesson of this entire wall is that Jews should not be living in Germany. We hope and we pray that that's... I know, people look at me going, I can't believe he said that. But at the end of the day, in hundreds of years, I'm hoping that, look, if I start explaining that more, I'm going to get further and further into problems, so I'm going to stop. Let's go back to history. Now, I can tell by your faces that I probably went too far. Now, there is no center. In 1148, the good times end in Spain because the Almohads come through and an Islamic, Talibanic, zealot, oppressive regime put an end to the good times. Of course, the greatest figure of this, Maimonides, is born just before that. He was the greatest product of the Golden Age of Spain. We never really got to enjoy the Golden Age of Spain for very long. They came through in the year of his bar mitzvah. But the situation goes worse and worse for Jews all over Europe now. And eventually even Spain, which has had this phenomenal, massive, dynamic, large community, even they, in 1492, of course, not just in the same year, not just in the same month, not just in the same week, but on the very same day that Columbus set sail for China. Yeah. He set sail for China. He thought he was in India. In fact, he was in America. So obviously, he had a Jewish navigator as well. This period is a period of the rise of codes. We don't have a center. So our center is the text. It is telling Jews how to behave as Jews in the world. And some of the great codes were written by Maimonides, by the Rif in North Africa and Spain, by the Rosh in Germany. And all of these great codes were written, and then they were synthesized just after the expulsion by a young boy who escaped from the expulsion with his family and grew up in the newly renaissance land of Israel because the Ottoman Empire had opened up its doors to Jews who could make it there. And that person, Yosef Karo, synthesized all of the great codes and created the last universally accepted book of Jewish law called the Shulchan Aruch. That is the definitive book of Jewish law. It is a synthesis of all of the medieval codes of Jewish law. Does everybody follow me? It's a little complex, but it's important to understand that. We also have codes in another sense. The rise of Jewish mysticism. I'm going to be talking about Kabbalah on Wednesday night. The rise of Jewish mysticism with the revelation of the Zohar here and the rise of an understanding of why are the Jewish people going through all this? What is the purpose in the world? What is our relationship with God? What is the real meaning of exile? Why are we caught between these two big ideologies, Christianity and Islam, who both seem to have originated from the Bible, but are fighting over, effectively, us? I mean, I know the Jewish people sometimes see themselves at the center of the world, but it really was the case that they were fighting either over the land of Israel or over what the role of the Jewish people. Why are we in exile? Now, I have gone over time. The last 500 years you know anyway, so I'm going to finish with a story. And this is a story that if you understand this story, it's very quick. It will enable you to understand the whole of the rest of Jewish history for the last 500 years, which I'll touch upon. As you know, roundabout, this is the expulsion from Spain. When a new anti-Semitic idea comes into the world, it soon becomes very trendy. People go, oh, that's a very good anti-Semitic idea. I think we'll try that here. Now, there is a new idea that comes in here, and that is let's take all of the Jews of a place, and let's put them in one area. Let's build a big wall around it. And so that if we need to know where the Jews are, we can find them. That idea is called, of course, a ghetto. And the most famous of the early ghettos is what? Venice. Has anyone been to the Venice Ghetto? Yep. It's an amazingly mystical place. All right. So round about here, in around 1520, the Venice Ghetto is very new. And a man turns up at the Venice Ghetto, and he's very weird looking. He's like 4.5 feet tall, and he's got a big flag, and he's got some bizarre clothing. And he gathers all the leaders of the Jewish community of Venice together, and he says to them, get me an audience with the Pope. And they say, well, maybe, but who are you? And he said, my name is David Haruveni, and I am a representative of. The lost 10 tribes that have been living all this time on the other side of the mystical river Sabbatyon that can only be crossed on Shabbat. And I'm here to tell you that the time of your redemption is at hand. They go, whoa! And within a few weeks, Raveni is on a horse and he's walking into the Vatican. The Pope at the time is Clement VII, one of the Medici popes, one of the actually very, very warm to the Jews. And Clement likes Raveni, and he gives him letters of introduction to go to communities all around the Mediterranean. He ends up in Portugal. Remember that Portugal is still in the grip of the Inquisition. And King John of Portugal welcomes him with diplomatic honors because he's not technically a Jew. He's a member of the House of Israel. Now, at the court of King John is a young man called Diego Pires. Diego Pires was born into a converso family. That means that a couple of generations earlier, under the pressure of the Inquisition, his family had converted to Christianity. But he knew his roots, and he was very taken by the charismatic Raveni. And he goes to Raveni one night, and he says to him, circumcise me. And Raveni says, no thank you. 2 reasons. 1, no thank you. Secondly, you do realize how much trouble we'll both be in if I do that. So Diego goes home and he circumcises himself overnight. Don't know why I added that. He circumcises himself, and the 2 of them have to get out of Portugal el pronto. They go on this big mystical tour. Joseph Caro writes that he remembers seeing them in Adrianople in 1927. This is all documented stuff. We have the diaries, we have evidence, we even have Raveni's flag. And eventually, in around 1530, Diego Pires, who's changed his name to Shlomo Molcho, says, I have to go where all Jewish boys have to go if they think they might be, a bit special. I have to go and I have to see the Pope. Raveni's already been to the Pope, so Molcho goes to the Pope. He goes to meet Clement. Clement really likes Molcho. Now, Molcho says this, Clement, we have an idea. Let's get all of the armies of Christian Europe together with the armies of the 10 tribes of Israel who are on the other side of the mystical river Sabbatyon that can only be crossed on Shabbat. Let's get them all together and have one last great crusade. We'll get rid of the Muslims out of the Holy Land, and we will establish an independent Jewish state backed by Western Christianity, because Clement, you know that you have to have an independent Jewish state in the land of Israel backed by Western Christianity before the Messiah can come. Clement goes, cool, but I'm only the Pope. I don't have an army. You have to go back and speak to the Christian kings of Europe. They go back to Portugal. They speak to King John. King John says, well, if Clement's in, I'm in, but I don't call the shots around here anymore. You have to go and speak to Charles V, the Doid of the Habsburg Empire, living in Regensburg. Charles V, the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, who kicked the Jews out of Spain. Charles V, whose uncle had just taken an entire country, Henry VIII, taken an entire country, England, out of the church. Charles V, who has just presided over the Diet at Worms that excommunicated Luther, was in no mood for these two Jewish boys coming to him. He took Molcho and he burnt him. And he sent Ruveni back to Spain in chains. This story has a tragic ending, but it is a huge story for the next 500 years of Jewish history, because it is the first time that a consciousness comes back into the Jewish world that we can potentially have our own homeland in the place that was promised to the forefathers of the Jewish people. Those events lead on, obviously, obviously on the other side of the Enlightenment, but lead on to the famous events of Sabbateanism here, the famous false messiah that rocked the whole world effectively. But the 18th century, if you want to know the origins of our Jewish world today, it is in the 18th century, the rise of all of the great movements that are in the Jewish world today, the rise of progressive Reform Judaism, the rise of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, the rise of Hasidism, all of which were responses to the pressures of the Enlightenment, but all focused to the search for the redemption from exile of the Jewish people. The 19th century is the story of emancipation. Most people don't realize that the fact that Jews have equal rights with other human beings in the world is no older than 150 years in most countries, even less in most countries of the world. And of course, in the 20th century, in the 20th century, you have two massive events that would be big on anywhere in this entire room. One, of course, is the Shoah, and the other is the rise of the State of Israel. And they happen within 3 years of each other. So from here, this is where this period here, this period of the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom, that is already the first time we really have an objective presence in the world. We for sure existed before then, but we actually have corroboration in various archaeological and chronicle events here. But we have 6 periods that we're looking at. We have all, this is still within the Bible. If you understand the major spiritual project, Bayit Rishon, the first temple, the second temple, the Talmudic, each one 500 years, the Gaonic, the Rishonim, and what we call the Acharonim. And obviously, many of you realize that I have absolutely skimmed at rocket speed over most of the detail, but we ran out of time. You have been an awesome audience, and I thank you for listening to everything I've talked about this evening. I'm going to do something unusual because I sense an energy. It is never, ever, ever my intention to offend anybody. The comment I made about Germany is an interesting observation that I make to some of my students who ask me, why do Jews keep going back to certain places where there seem to be constant recurring problems? This is not necessarily a belief that I have about the future. Obviously, it's a totally different thing, and it wasn't meant in any sense about Germany today or anyone in the audience. Can everyone accept that I was illustrating a point? Okay, so I just want people to know that I apologize if anyone took offense at that, but because I actually am totally in love with Germany. It's one of the few places I actually come back.